A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. So we'll start the day with the prelims theme of the day. So today we'll be shifting to geography. So the theme today is the ocean currents. The first thing is you have to talk about the reasons for the formation of the ocean currents. Then their categorization as warm or cold currents, and then what is the region of their formation along the which coast of the continent they are formed, and also what kind of impact they are having on the local weather or on the economic activity in a particular region. So reasons for formation, which of them are cold currents, which of them are warm currents, what is the region they are being formed, and also what kind of impact they are having on the economic activities and the local weather. So this is what you're supposed to be writing for today's theme of the day. And I have also gone through the last week's theme of the day that I had given on Buddhism and Jainism. Many of you have really, it was a very encouraging response that you have come forward to write such brilliant write-ups on whatever issue that I had asked. So I personally went through many of the comments, and I really liked the details into which Kratisha and Shalabha have gone. So keep writing that, and I'm also asking insights to pin a good comment or a good answer to this theme. So keep writing, and also you need to go in a much deeper, because for instance I asked about the sects of Buddhism as and also about Jainism. So you just go to tell that there are two sects mainly, which is Digambars and Shvetambars. That is, of course, that is definitely there, but you also need to go a little deeper. For instance, in 2018 question paper, there was a question that was asked: the Stanakwasi sect is related to which of the religions? So it is actually, it comes under Jainism, and it is very similar to the Shvetambars. So many of them often call themselves as Shvetambar Stanakwasis, but you at least have to know, you have to be familiar that Stanakwasi sect is to do with the Jainism. So therefore you have to go a little deeper, dig a little deeper into the things. So not just mentioning that these are the two sects, but you'll also need to dissect a little bit more than that. So try to do that in the case of ocean currents. So now we'll be starting with the topics of the day. We will start with the first topic of the day, which is the gender issues regarding women, the position of women in the Indian Army. So in this, the recent news that we're going to see is that the Ministry of Defence has now issued a formal letter, and according to this, it has granted permanent commission to the women officers in the Indian Army. So this will be part of your GS1 syllabus, which talks about the Indian society per se, because this is a component of an Indian society which shows deep-rooted bias against a woman and the issue of patriarchy, because of which the women had not been given equal opportunities in the Indian Army. It is also a part of your GS2 syllabus, which talks of various vulnerable sections of the society, among which women are one. It can also be a part of the GS4 syllabus, where you talk of discrimination, prejudice and bias present against a particular section of population, which is again unethical. So now what we are going to be discussing is the various that this whole thing shows. So now the women being granted permanent commission in the Indian Army, but it took such a long time to do so. In fact, the fight reached up to the highest level, that is the Supreme Court, and now the Supreme Court directed or has told the government to issue an order to this effect. So the issue had to be fought at the highest level at the Supreme Court, shows how deep-rooted this bias and prejudice has been against the women and their role in the armed forces. So first it shows is the prejudice that is prevalent against a particular section of the society. The second issue is obvious, that it also shows the patriarchal attitude that several from the armed forces were against such a step to give equal opportunities to the women, because of this patriarchy, that there was a resistance from within, that what if women come and sit as the bosses, so it is difficult for the men to accept that. So therefore it shows the patriarchal attitude in the society. The third thing is that often it is said that women are not capable of these challenging tasks because they have certain physical limitations. So they are biologically more weaker, the weaker gender, and also they have physical limitations of marriage and pregnancy, the childbirth and all that. So they will not be able to match up with the physical might of the men in the armed forces. So often this reason is given of physical limitations that is used to resist such reforms. The next thing shows the opposition. That is, these kind of reforms in the society are not always welcomed with wholeheartedness, because as we just discussed now, that there will be more resistance from within the army that such positions to the women should not be given. So there is opposition to whenever some progressive reforms are being made to empower a particular vulnerable section of the society, then there is always the opposition, and this is another issue. Next is a minority. Minority, why? Because in India, out of nearly 40,800 officers who are serving in the army, the women form just 1,600 in number out of this huge number of 40,800. So therefore, the overall percentage of women itself at various levels in the armed forces is very low in India, and they form a minority. So these are the 5 important issues when we talk about this whole topic. And you can also show a timeline saying that in the pre-independence era also women have contributed so much to the freedom struggle, and even in the post-independent India, they have brought laurels to the armed forces, and they have won several battles. So you can show this timeline as pre-independence and post-independence, and you can show Rani Jhansi from there till Minty Agarwal. Minty Agarwal of the Indian Air Force is the squadron leader, and she was even part of the team that guided the wing commander Abhinandan Vartaman when we carried out Balakot air strike by the Indian Air Force on Pakistan. So that time Minty Agarwal was also part of the team who was guiding Abhinandan Vartaman. So like this, you can give several examples to show that the women have brought laurels, and they have significantly contributed to we winning the wars in India, winning wars against its enemies. So therefore, there shouldn't be any reason why these reforms should be delayed, and that is a whole. And then as part of the way forward, what we need to do is to carry out more gender sensitization programs for those in the armed forces, so they welcome such progressive changes. And second is, we also have to look at the examples of the other countries. So in countries like United States and Israel, women are even allowed in active combat. So they are considered and treated on par with the men, and they are given equal opportunities. So just the participation of women in their armed forces have not made their armed forces any weaker. So they have only made it more stronger. So we need to learn from the examples of these countries that it is possible to include women in combat positions and yet keep our armies stronger, and that is nothing to do with the armed forces getting weaker because of the inclusion of the women. So this can be written as part of your way forward. Now we go to the next topic. So now we'll be talking about the India-Sri Lanka relations. So this article was basically on the recent issues that has happened in the last 19 and 20 regarding the relations between the two countries. So first we'll be talking about investments. So in the year 2019, Sri Lanka, India and Japan, they had agreed to jointly develop this East Container Terminal project. But however, no further decision has been taken on this. After they together agreed to develop this project, there has been no further agreement, or there has been no final decision on this part. So this is one issue where 3 countries have come together to develop a project, but then there is no final decision on that has been made. The second issue is the debt and the currency swap. Sri Lanka has been requesting India for a debt that totals nearly $960 million, and also Sri Lanka has been requesting for a currency swap under bilateral agreement with India and also under the SAARC agreements. But these 2 requests have also been pending. So one is the debt which was demanded by Sri Lanka of $960 million, and the currency swap with the bilateral and the SAARC agreements. Both these have been now kept pending. Next is a visit in 2019. So usually the norm is that whenever any new president or prime minister gets elected in India, then the Sri Lanka's president or prime minister is going to visit India first. But this time in the year 2019, when Sri Lanka had a newly elected president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, it was the Minister of External Affairs, S. Jaishankar, who visited Colombo, and it was not the Prime Minister. So all of these symbolism play a very important role in diplomacy, and they are all keenly watched. So this is one issue that Sri Lanka also was disturbed with. Next is the discriminatory tendencies. Sri Lanka somewhere feels that by comparing what assistance that India has been extending to the countries in the neighborhood, Sri Lanka feels that there is a discriminatory tendency because India has been giving varying amounts of development assistance to different countries in the region. So this discriminatory tendency is there, and this is the perception of Sri Lanka. The next issue is whatever be the relation between India and Sri Lanka, that is always seen from a China's prism. That if Sri Lanka is concluding some agreement then with China, then that is seen with a suspicion in India, and vice versa, because we feel that we are seeing all the relations through the prism of China and increasing China's presence in our neighborhood. So this has also created problems in we having independent relations with each other without the influence of any third country. So every issue is being seen, or every development is being seen with a Chinese prism. These are the 5 important issues that have happened in the recent past. Now we'll see some positives. In that, the first is a line of credit. So in 2019, when Sri Lankan president visited India, so that time the government, the Indian Prime Minister, announced a $450 million line of credit to Sri Lanka. So this is one positive measure that has taken place last year. Second is that we are completely aware that a good India and Sri Lanka relation can be a cornerstone for peaceful and prosperous South Asia. And this in fact is the aim, that we need to establish peaceful and prosperous South Asia, and we also completely acknowledge that our good relations, our healthy relations, is a cornerstone for peaceful and prosperous South Asia. The third is that if we look at the international examples of Singapore, Malaysia, or Australia, New Zealand, where we realize that the smaller countries' economic success, in this case Singapore's economic success, and in this case New Zealand's economic success, is tied to a strong relationship with a bigger neighbor, Malaysia in this case and Australia in this case. So the relationship between the bigger and the smaller power, which are in such close proximity, their good relation and their stable relation is very important for the economic development of the entire region. So this fact also we know that we need to establish a strong and a stable relationship. So this acknowledgement has also happened. And then recently, Suvas Area is the ambulance service which India has successfully assisted in Sri Lanka. So that is particularly because of the COVID-19 crisis. So this shows how India has been cooperating with its neighbor Sri Lanka in the time of crisis. When it is itself facing a lot of crisis, it is still coming out and helping the other countries in the neighborhood with these services. So Suvas Area is an ambulance service which India has assisted in Sri Lanka regarding tackling the COVID-19. So on this front, there is also an acknowledgement that we need to further deepen our cooperation in the health sector, particularly in the case of telemedicine. So there is a lot of scope for cooperation, and that has to be done. So these are the various positive things that have happened between India-Sri Lanka relations in the last year. So we have seen the India-Sri Lanka relations, the recent issues that are there, and the recent positive things as well. Now we'll look at the next topic. So we will be talking about the non-alignment movement and what is its relevance for India in the current global scenario. So non-alignment movement, as we are all aware, was a response of India soon after its independence, when it saw that the entire globe was getting polarized between United States on the one hand and USSR on the other hand. So there were two poles and it was a bipolar world. So what India says today is that non-alignment movement as a concept was relevant for a bipolar world where there were two superpowers. But now we are talking about multipolarity. So when we are talking of multipolarity, there are so many global issues that are happening in the world, be it terrorism or climate change or the pandemic now, where several countries will have to play their roles coming together in a cooperative way, and there is nothing like bipolarity, or there is nothing like there is one superpower in the global world. So there are multiple countries, all of them playing their own role. It has led to a situation of multipolarity. So in a scenario like this, NAM as a concept has assumed irrelevance for India. As a concept, NAM has become irrelevant. So this was India's latest stance, and in fact this was told by our External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar himself, that NAM as a concept has become irrelevant because we have moved from a bipolar to a multipolar world, because there are several global issues like terrorism, climate change, pandemics and all that, where several countries have emerged important, and only through cooperative and collaborative measures we can surmount these global issues and global challenges. So therefore non-alignment as a movement has as a concept has become irrelevant. However, what the external minister also has told is it does not mean giving up entirely on the non-alignment movement, but rather it is just selectively taking what is important for India. For instance, in the earlier non-alignment movement, what India believed in was the disentanglement. That is, India is not going to entangle itself with anything that is happening in the world between the two superpowers. So it is not going to bother itself about any such thing. But now India has to come out of this, and it has to be part of some difficult decision making. So it can no longer remain disentangled as it did in the past. And similarly, it does not mean that India is going to give up its independence because it is giving up the concept of NAM. So the concept of NAM also said that India is neither part of the US bloc nor is part of the USSR bloc. It is a sovereign independent country. It will have its own path for development. So when I say that India feels that NAM as a concept has become irrelevant, that does not mean India will be compromising in any way on its independence and sovereignty. On the one hand, it believes that the idea of disentanglement, which was a part of the NAM movement, where India wouldn't get entangled with any of the worldly affairs, then that cannot be applied in the present world, because there are so many things happening in the world, and the globe has now the countries, there is so much of integration between the countries that it is impossible for India to be not affected by something that is happening elsewhere in the world, because it is an integrated world. So therefore we will have to be part of some difficult decision making. So therefore this disentanglement as an idea is no longer going to be relevant. So we will no longer remain disentangled from difficult decisions, but at the same time we wouldn't also compromise on our independence or sovereignty. So this is very important. But at the same time, India has also made it very clear that India was never a part of any alliance system, nor will it be a part of any alliance system going further. So why is this alliance system making its appearance? Why is India talking about it? Is because the United States has now a kind of war against China, where it is saying that United States and India can partner together in an alliance to counter China. So therefore what here India is referring to is that to beware of such alliances with the United States, because it is only a war between United States and China. So India does not want to be a party to something. India does not want to be unnecessarily drawn into the US-China conflict. So therefore it is saying that India was never a part of an alliance system, nor is it going to be a part of an alliance system in the future. So what we are going to adopt, the approach we are going to adopt is a carefully calibrated balanced approach. So in this, on the one hand, we will ensure that our strategic independence is maintained, and also on the other hand, we will make sure that we are not unnecessarily drawn into alliances as part of some enmity between two different countries. So for example, in this case, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has been making references to the fact that India and United States can collaborate together to counter China. So India does not want to be unnecessarily driven into a conflict between United States and China. Also, India does not want to even raise its tensions with China with any other on any other forum in the world. It believes that these issues can be spoken and resolved in a bilateral talks with the China. So therefore, it says that we are going to adopt a carefully calibrated balance where we will maintain our strategic independence and will also be careful to be not part of any alliances like the Indo-US alliance, that is the aim of which will be to counter China. So those alliances we are not going to be part of. Also, the External Affairs Minister Jaishankar has also told that India should now try and build more coalitions with several middle powers like many of the European countries, European Union countries and Japan. So with these other powers also we need to build more coalitions. So this is what the India's new stance on the non-alignment movement is. So this comes under your GS syllabus 2, which talks of the international relations and also the these movements like the non-alignment movement soon after our independence will be part of your GS2. It can also be part of your GS1 syllabus, which talks of post-independence consolidation. So your NAM could very well come under that. So the kind of question you may have is what is NAM and what is its relevance today? How is today's NAM different from the NAM that we adopted soon after independence? So you can write these that the current NAM means for India that the context is different from a bipolar world to a multipolar world. So NAM is no longer relevant in the sense with which it was conceptualized soon after India's independence at the Bandung Conference. So that concept of NAM is no longer relevant because we are a multipolar world now with global issues. But yes, what it means for India is not to have alliances but to have a carefully calibrated balance. We will continue to maintain our strategic independence. At the same time, we will also try and build coalitions with several middle powers. So this is our new concept of NAM as told by S. Jaishankar. So now we will go to the next topic. So the next topic we'll be talking about is the US-China relations and the escalating tensions between them, which can also be termed as a new Cold War. So this can appear as part of your GS1 again as part of post-independence consolidation, that there is a Cold War 2.0 that is kind of emerging. So they may ask you to comment upon it, or it can be a part of your GS2 syllabus where they are asking what can be the impact on India of a worsening US-China relations. So in these two cases you can have this concept applied. So the recent news is about the United States decision that it is going to close down China's consulate in Houston, and as a retaliatory measure even China has decided to close down the US consulate in Chengdu. So this measures and countermeasures has kind of escalated, has been escalating in the past few months like this, and this is the first time that such a measure has been taken of closing the consulates in each other countries after 1979, when both the countries had normalized the ties with each other. So now the US has accused China that China was engaged in economic espionage, and even it had attempted to steal some scientific research information also. So China has obviously denied all these allegations, and US has also put restrictions on the students coming from China. So it has imposed sanctions on the Chinese officials over this Hong Kong security law also. So we have seen that there have been a lot of tension that is escalating between the two countries. Recently it started off with a tariff war that the United States imposed first and started imposing in the year 2018. After that again that has only grown in the strength. So initially it was about just the trade and technology, that there was a trade war, and the United States also was very apprehensive about the Chinese 5G technology, and now it has also told its partners in the private sector not to engage with the Chinese firm which is engaged with the 5G technology, so not to buy equipments from that firm. So it started off as a trade and a technology war, but now this has snowballed into a geopolitical contest between the two powers of US and China. So this is very much akin to the Cold War 1.0 that we had between the Soviet Union and the United States. So in this case, this particular article, it tells that this has resulted into what is called as a cyclical trap. let's see how this cyclical trap is. For United States, it feels threatened that the rise of China can threaten the US dominated international order. And in order to protect the US dominated international order, United States has started a very confrontational policy with China, where it started with the tariffs war and then the trade technology, and then now it has snowballed into a geopolitical contest. So now that has as of now ended with the closing down of the consulates in each other country. So therefore, United States feels threatened that US dominated international order may be in threat because of the rising China, which has made the US adopt a confrontational policy. And on China's front, China has already been very assertive in Asia. So we have had seen several examples with respect to the assertive China. It's adopting muscular approach in the South China Sea, in Hong Kong, in the Galvan Valley with India. So China has been very assertive in the Asian region. And the way, the kind of assertion, the kind of aggression and muscular approach that China has shown, it reflects that China is ready for that long escalation which might come from the United States. So this has both these US adopting a confrontational policy and China showing its aggression and being ready for that long escalation from the other party. So it shows that this is leading to a cyclical trap where one is taking a measure and the other is taking a retaliatory countermeasures. So these measures and countermeasures have led to a cyclical trap where the escalation and the tension between the two countries, US and China, is only escalating. So this kind of has given rise to a situation similar to a Cold War that was happening between the Soviet Union and United States. So this flowchart you can draw, and then you can say that cyclical trap is there because of the measures and countermeasures. So then you can say that all of this tendency can further escalate and it can again snowball into Cold War 2.0. So this representation you can make in your answer. So now we'll go to the next topic. So now we will see about India-South Korea relationship. So in this relationship, a small aspect, which is the cultural relations between India and South Korea, has been explored in this particular article. So we will basically restrict ourselves to just what has been written in the article. So first, as it talks about various issues between India and South Korea relationship. First is the economic partnership. So even though economic partnership is there, but then this partnership has been struck at just 22 billion annually. So this 22 billion economic partnership annually is definitely much below the potential that we can achieve. So this is one issue. Second is a defense partnership. The defense partnership also could have been much more comprehensive and all round, but however, this too has gotten restricted to just sale and purchase of the weapon systems. So this is the second issue. The third is the prevalence of the cultural prejudices. So first of all, when we consider the treatment that is given to the South Koreans, as Indians, we understand the culture of Japan, we understand the culture of China, but then to distinctively understand the culture of South Korea, that is a rare thing. So we do not really understand the distinctiveness of the Korean culture vis-a-vis the Chinese culture and the Japanese culture. So we do not know them, and also when they are in India, they too face a lot of discrimination and prejudice in the Indian society. And as far as Indians and South Korea are concerned, even there, the integration of the Indian population with the local population has not happened. The Indian population there also, there have been instances of racial prejudice or discrimination that has been meted out to the Indian population there. So the bottom line is, if we need to have strong, stable relationship, we need to be more appreciative of each other's cultural values. So we need to understand and mutually respect the cultural values, and that is the foundation for building a robust relationship between the two countries. So as far as building the role of the Indian Culture Center that was established in Seoul nearly 10 years ago, so that is said to be a step in the right direction. What does it do? It promotes people to people ties. So that is the most important for building a long lasting and robust relationship. So what kind of activities does the Indian Culture Center conduct there? Is the Indian Culture Center, it tries to teach the South Indian dances in various elementary schools in South Korea. and it also organizes sessions which are about the Indian cuisine and South Korea. So these kinds of efforts that are being put by the Indian Culture Center in South Korea, which is very commendable, and it is doing the job of familiarizing the South Koreans with the Indian cultural aspects. So this we need to do on a much more larger scale and a deeper scale, so that we really appreciate each other's cultural distinctiveness and values, and that forms the foundation for a long lasting and robust relationship. So this was the only thing that was present in the India South Korea article. 3 important issues and how we are tackling the cultural issue, that we are not aware of each other's cultures. So then comes the role of the Indian Culture Center. So now we will go to the next topic. Is concerned. So the next small topic we are going to discuss is the communicable diseases, and that is the healthcare issues. This will come under your GS2 syllabus, which talks of the healthcare sector. So in that, communicable disease, non-communicable diseases, they are very important. And communicable diseases, year after year we have increasing incidences of malaria, dengue, chikungunya and all. So therefore a question is very much probable in this particular case. And also in case studies you may be asked that your district has too much of incidence of dengue and malaria and communicable diseases year after year. So what measures as the district magistrate you are going to do in your district? What measures are you going to take in your district? So this can also come as a part of case study, how you are going to handle the communicable disease breakout. So that can be a part of the case study as well. So the piece of information we are talking about here is just a small one point that you can write as part of the answer. So the information is that in Gurugram, so the health authorities have decided that they are going to release the Gambusia fish into the water bodies in Gurugram in order to tame the mosquitoes. So during monsoon, the stagnant water bodies will stagnant water gets collected, and that provides a very fertile ground for the mosquitoes to breed. And the more they breed, the more is the probability of a breakout of malaria, dengue and other such mosquito vector-borne diseases. So what the health authorities have decided is to introduce the Gambusia fish in the various ponds in the villages. So this has been done even in several other places, not just in Gurugram. It is done every year by almost all the municipal authorities. So what this Gambusia fish does is it can eat the larvae of at least 100 to 300 mosquitoes each day. So and they can also live easily in shallow ponds. So that's why it makes the Gambusia fish very much suitable for tackling the outbreaks of such communicable diseases. So when you are writing about handling of communicable diseases, you can write that as a district magistrate, I am going to make the staff introduce these Gambusia fish in various water bodies, so that that is also one of the preventive measures. So that you can also write when you are specifically asked a question on handling of communicable diseases. So this is a small example of tackling the mosquitoes using Gambusia fish. So now we'll go to the next topic. So next topic we will be discussing about the presidential system and the merits of the presidential system. This article was written by Shashi Tharoor, and what he argues in the entire article is regarding the flaws in the parliamentary system and why a presidential system and a move to the presidential system could be beneficial for India. So this can come as part of your GS2 syllabus, where you are talking about the parliamentary form of governance and the parliamentary system in India. And it's also one of the very conventional questions which can get asked anytime, which is the parliamentary system versus the presidential system. The differences between the two, and should India really make this transition to a presidential system? So this is a very favorite question that can be asked anytime, and it's also a popular question in the UPSC interviews also. So you must have your opinion ready for the same. So today we're discussing what Shashi Tharoor talks about in the articles. He says that the parliamentary system has a lot of issues plaguing it. One is there are a lot of political parties, and the candidates, it feels we have already seen the data for criminalization of politics. And also once these the politicians, it is not that they have these coherent set of ideas which are linked with a particular political party and they are going to be loyal to it, whether they are winning or losing. So that is not the case. They have a lot of self-interest, vested interest which they want to be served, and because of which they get engaged in horse trading, they defect to the party through which they have gotten elected, they just shift their alliances so easily. And also, even if the party is getting elected and is forming a government, it is not that the party enjoys a lot of majority. Several of these governments, they are sustaining based on just a threadbare majority. So that is there. And also, when formation of the government requires alliances with some other partners, whether it is another political party or the independent candidates, then the prime minister will also not have that flexibility in making the cabinet appointments. The prime minister will have to think that these partners who have supported the party to form the government will also be offered, should also be offered cabinet berths. So therefore, there won't be any flexibility to appoint the person of merit to the cabinet, and these ministers, these other supporters will also have to be given cabinet berths in order to pacify them. And also, because of all these, the deliberations in the parliament have also fallen to a very considerable extent. So many bills and even the budgets are passed with hardly any discussion on them. So this is again done, and the conduct in the parliament has also fallen. So those who are not getting elected, that is those who form part of the opposition, they feel that the best way to show their opposition is to stall the proceedings by just raising some slogans and going to the well of the house and shouting all of these things by interrupting, so that the speaker will will adjourn the session. So that will be the sort of conduct in the parliament. So all these have all resulted in poor governance in the country, and measures not being taken for the welfare of the people. So in this context, what Shashi Tharoor says is that it is time that we move to a presidential system because of the several merits that it enjoys. First, he says that there is going to be a stability of tenure. If you look at the parliamentary systems these days, the governments, the alliances are shifting so frequently, the MPs are defecting and joining the other parties so frequently that there is hardly any stability for the government. And without a stable government, good governance cannot happen. So with a presidential form, there is a fixed tenure, and therefore there is going to be stability of tenure. So when there is stability, there can also be more certainty about good governance. The next is with respect to the appointments. The appointments too can be based on merit, and the person who is best suited for the job can be appointed, rather than reserving berths for people who are supporting the political party to form the government. Because the appointments are also done based on the merit and the best suited person is taken, there is stability as well. The focus directly is on the governance and how to deliver good governance to the citizens, because the head of the government or the head of a political party does not have to bother about who should be kept in goodwill and all that. That focus will not be there. Who should be given birth, when should somebody be punished, when should somebody be rewarded, all of that focus will not be there, and the focus will directly be on the governance. And this also makes it very easier for the citizens to hold the person accountable, because they know that there is one person at the top, and whatever happens in the country, so they know that it is somebody there who enjoys the stability of tenure and who is looking after everything. So holding the person accountable, holding the head accountable is also easy for the citizens. But one very important opposition that always comes up when we talk of the presidential rule is that in the case of a presidential system like the United States, there is one president at the top, and it is feared that this president may assume very dictatorial powers, and there could be dictatorial tendencies. So the opposition is that just one person at the top can make him a dictator. But what Shashi Tharoor argues is that this risk of dictatorship is also flawed. The thinking about this risk of dictatorship is also flawed, because if you look at the current Lok Sabha, one party enjoys absolute majority, rather brute majority in Lok Sabha is enjoyed by one party. So therefore, even if you have one person as a head, or if you have a cabinet as a head, but in the Lok Sabha, if you have that much amount of majority, whatever bill is proposed is going to get passed by Lok Sabha, just because of the majority. The sheer majority that the political party enjoys is going to get it through all the bills that it is proposing in the Lok Sabha. So this is also a kind of dictatorship, to say so. So therefore there is not much of a difference. If you are afraid of dictatorship, then you should also be afraid of the tendency in the Lok Sabha now. So everything that is introduced by the government will eventually get passed because of the sheer numbers that it enjoys. So the risk of the dictatorship in the case of a presidential system is also very flawed. So this is what Shashi Tharoor says, and eventually he says that in the case of democracy should itself be an end, and whatever we do should be to strengthen this democracy. And now we need a kind of democracy that should deliver progress to our people. So therefore he argues that if we are aiming for a democracy that should deliver progress to people, the best way to do this is to shift to a presidential system from the current parliamentary system, even though democracy is going to be the path to that. So this is about Shashi Tharoor's view on presidential and the parliamentary system. Now we'll see the next one. These were the other articles which were not really important from the exam point of view. Now we'll quickly revise the speaker issue that I had given as an assignment or homework the other day. So you had to give three each in issues, articles, and the Supreme Court or any other court judgments. So in the issues, first we'll be talking about the discretionary power, that the speaker has a discretion to decide whether a bill is a money bill or not, and his decision on that is going to be final. So we saw how this was being misused in deciding the Aadhaar bill to be the money bill. So whenever you're reading that, whenever you're writing that, so when deciding a bill as a money bill or not, there is going to be a core part of the bill and there is going to be an incidental or a peripheral part of the bill. So the courts have said that when if matters that come under Article 110, if they form the core part of the bill, then it will be called as money bill. If they just form the peripheral part of the bill, then it cannot be called as a money bill. But yes, under Article 110, so this speaker can decide whether a bill is money bill or not. Next is the neutrality, which is again being questioned because the speaker, even after being elected to the office of speaker, retains the membership of the party, which is not so in the case of UK. The speaker, once elected as a speaker, will resign from the party membership. Next is the anti-defection, and we have seen several examples how the speaker, because there is no time frame within which the speaker will have to decide on a petition, the speaker keeps sitting on these petitions whenever he or she has to favor somebody or pass it with so much haste if the speaker wants the disqualification of the person against to whom petition has been made. So these are. Then quickly we'll go through the articles. Article 93 is related to the appointment, and 102 is related to the disqualification under anti-defection law, and 1103 is related to the money bill and the matters that fall under the money bill. And then the cases are the three important cases. The Quixote Holohan case, which we already discussed the other day, where the Supreme Court had told that the decision of the speaker is subject to judicial review, then on limited grounds. Then in the K. Meghchandra Singh case, this was in the Manipur Assembly case, where the court held that we must actually reconsider the role of the speaker as a quasi-judicial authority while the speaker decides the disqualification petitions. Rather, the parliament can have an independent tribunal which is going to do these type of decisions instead of the speaker. And the third important case is the Jagjit Singh versus the state of Haryana case, where the court questioned the impartial role that the speaker is supposed to be playing. So it raised questions on the confidence that has been that people have in the role of the speaker and the impartial role that he or she is going to play. So this case questioned the impartial role of the speaker. So these were the important three cases. We will see today's question, which is related to the current affairs for prelims. So the Beijing rules recently seen in news is related to what? Is it related to women empowerment, juvenile justice, WTO rules on trade facilitation, or WHO rules on air pollution? So last time I had asked about I-Commit, and many of you have given the right answer as Ministry of Power. And I hope you have also gone through what I-Commit actually is and what does it do. So do answer this question as well. So like this, we'll keep covering something in news every day. So that's it for today. Thank you.